Friday, GM announced plans to bring corporate workers back to physical locations at least 3 days per week. After significant backlash from employees, though, today they walked back that plan.
The workplace shapes human behavior, the humans reshape workplace. And we are now in a moment in which we're not just human. We're sort of half human, we're like cyborgs, right?
More employers are mandating that workers return to offices at least 3 days a week. Are these return to office mandates a good thing for business or not?
We're having a lot of conversations that were sort of shoved under the rug. I mean, I think that people are personally having these conversations amongst family or close friends, but as these become more public conversations, take, for example, social movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter and concerns about racial discrimination, gender discrimination, I think that given this kind of broader conversation on multiple levels, that employers do need to think about their employees perhaps more than they did before and creating what we call a human-centered, more diverse, equitable, socially just work environment. At the same time, one cannot just give on a platter. The work, here's everything that you want. If you think or you have the mindset of, if I attract the best talent and I give them the best amenities, and I'm not just talking like necessarily yoga rooms, but access to work family more kind of balance or things, then people will, as some have argued, bring their best selves to work. And if you bring your best self to work and you're not as anxious or depressed, then you're going to work much better and more productively and contribute to the bottom line. That might not be as easy for us to measure in like metrics immediately, but I think that in terms of an investment in people in relation to business is where I would argue work organizations should be looking at prioritizing people. And anthropologists look laterally. You don't just look at tech, you don't just look at people, it's how do these things interact? People are using technology. People are involved in the environment. So you have to think about how a more holistic, as a kind of like eco-cultural system. And that makes it harder to look at the priorities, but it also looks at how do these different pieces, technology, right? Cost, value, how can I best have them work effectively together? And the people are part of and make up that system together. It should be an inclusive process, one, including people who are working, but also thinking at it, there's a tendency to look, you can't look at the individual level and you can't just look at the workplace level. You need to think as it being interactive. The workplace shapes human behavior, the humans reshape workplace. And we are now in a moment in which we're not just human. We're sort of half human, we're like cyborgs, right? So we now have to think about that. So we need to think about workplaces as systems or structures. And yes, that's a very holistic way of looking at it. And then how are the different pieces working together? What social scientists bring to the table is an ability to map out the system, how it's working, formally and informally, because very often you have a formal organizational chart about how things should work and who is leading what and who has a job. But if you look, there's always an informal social structure, like who's doing the work, who's not, who's mentoring who has allies and things like that. So that's part of the system. That is the system. That's the system, how it actually works. And that's what anthropologists have been able to look at. I mean, is like, okay, what's really going on? I think it's really interesting to see the impact of social movements and how they're incorporated or shape the workplace. And we had Me Too several years back. We had the George Floyd murder and the rise of Black Lives Matter. And I think at this point that, corporations far more in the last 5 to 10 years had to be much more responsive to social and political unrest. I went to a diversity, equity, inclusion conference back in December, and I was floored at the topic because they were not topics that were discussed amongst diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals at workshops or conferences I attended 10 years ago. The first opening conference panel was on social and political unrest. The next one was about migration and immigration. There were a number of them about, racial inequality and so on and so forth. So I think that all of these movements, not just Black Lives Matter, but a sort of attention to diversity, different kinds of gender and sexual identities, a real acknowledgement of being queer and queer workplaces. There's so much that is impacting the workplace, especially as we get into Gen Z who care about social justice, climate justice. I can't believe I didn't even mention that. You do see corporations being responsive. So my optimism is always kind of measured. I'm pretty optimistic as a social scientist and as a person, but with some, healthy dose of let's see. These are very complicated sets of issues. How do people form groups in an office? How do they forge a social and worldview of their being part of a collective entity, which is the symbols and the rituals? And so a purpose of an office is interesting. On the one hand, if you think about like how people work, but in fact, people are also involved, whether it's a trading floor or elsewhere, in what anthropologists and others call sense making, gathering incidental information. Hear the guy over in the corner who's whispering about a deal. You talk to your neighbor, you go out for drinks afterwards, and you are absorbing a whole series of sensory information, body language, all these kinds of things that are also infusing how you read the market, how you act in the market. So offices are really important in ways that we don't think about. Is that socializing? Is that innovation? Yes, it's part of socializing. It's part of innovation. But here is where we really see the importance of being in a physical space at least some of the time, whether it's an office or a trading floor. And I think we really need to think about whether or not sense making can take place in digital form. Many people have said to me in interviews otherwise that Zoom is an equal playing field, that you see these boxes and everybody sort of can talk. On the other hand, I have people who have felt very sort of never, even in Zoom, felt like they could not talk. I've had a number of women of color talk to me and say, you know what, women in general, every time I have to get on a Zoom call, my company says I have to put on my best face, bring my best face. And this was more in the time of total remote work, and I'm exhausted. Now, I'm sorry that all of us would be exhausted, bringing our best faces. But, how that impacts a particular individual in terms of their gender, their race, their class, and ethnicity. I love the idea that it's an equal playing field, and I'm glad that people feel that way on Zoom. I'm not sure that it's always as equal a playing field as we would like. What is the office in the metaverse? How do people engage with one another? It's kind of a fascinating moment. So I'm very intrigued about the possibilities of entering into the metaverse. What are the skills and the training that need to be given? These are really things that are happening, and they're impacting almost every profession, including, for example, human resources, who suddenly, have to know AI, all these things that 10 years ago would have never been part and parcel, or very rarely part of their repertoire or how they were being trained. Now we have to really think about upskilling, reskilling. What does it mean for everyone in this moment of sort of working with a co-pilot? So I think it's a really interesting moment again. On the one hand, you see people very utopic in their ideas that this is going to be the most amazing future in the world, which is what a majority of the people said at the Metaverse and Cities Summit. And then you had people who were like, hang on, I've seen this a little bit before, this kind of euphoric moment about technology. So during the dot-com era, if you remember, when everybody was like, this is transforming, nothing will be ever the same. You will be on a laptop wherever, place won't matter. It's going to be a really interesting time to think about sort of what are the possibilities with AI, metaverse, and what do we need to be concerned about with these tools, because there is so much possibility for good. We need to make sure that it happens. If we can understand behavior in the workplace and how people are behaving, how can we then design the workplace so that people are comfortable? But I mean, it's a moving target right now. So can we actually, if we're designing a workplace, a physical environment, a digital, let's see in a month or two, are people adapting? Because people, it's not just the work design that you create then shapes the people, but the people will reshape the work environment and redesign it to some extent within limits. And so right now it would be really interesting to see how they're doing it, including how are they designing their lives? How are they designing that you're not just designing workplaces, you're designing environments that include the workplace, but are beyond it. So where are people walking to when they're working? Where are they getting inspired? Maybe there's artwork somewhere, right? So it's a very expansive, what is the community that you're partially designing for? But those are the kinds of things that I think you can bring the sort of social science about how people use the environment and work really closely with designers, not in silos, but together to figure these things out.